What's going on, guys? I am in my basement, in my studio, and I'm doing something a little bit different today. I'm podcasting. I'm bringing the podcast back. I'm excited about it. I've been going back and forth about this for months and months and months, and I decided, why not? Let's try it. I'm also going to do it a little bit different. I'm also going to say straight up, I'm not going to throw a ton of production value into this. I'm going to be sitting here at my desk or sitting out in the world, maybe once a week, just recording. And there's probably not going to be other people. It's just going to be me storytelling. And that's kind of the whole purpose of this. I've actually deleted all my old podcasts, and I'm reinventing this channel called Travel, Photography, and Life with Brendan Vanson. And that's exactly what it's going to be. I'm just going to sit here and storytell. I love storytelling. And I think that it's going to be a fun thing to do. And maybe give you guys like a little bit more of an insight as to what life is like as a travel photographer, what it was like as a travel photographer, and just some fun things that happened along the way, some crazy things that happened along the way. I drove a scooter down Africa. I almost died of malaria in the Congo. I've been robbed of my camera gear in Ecuador. I've slept on beaches in Brazil to save money. I've had lots of crazy things that happened to me. And so I kind of want to I want to share those with you. And I think it'll be fun. Especially because a lot of those things happened, well before I did a YouTube channel. So I think it'll be fun to share that. And I hope you guys enjoy this. The first episode is just going to be explaining, how this all happened, how I became a travel photographer. And I'm not going to go into crazy depth because there's so many micro stories along the way that I eventually want to tell about this journey that I'm kind of just going to cover the broader, this is what went down, this is how it went down, and eventually we'll get to those smaller stories. I get asked a lot about how I became a travel photographer. And honestly, it wasn't something I planned. So I think it's a pretty interesting story. And it kind of all starts back in Japan. I was 13 years old and I got lucky enough to get to go on a student exchange. I went on this exchange for a summer in Japan, and my parents gave me a bunch of these disposable cameras. And I remember on that trip just absolutely loving capturing everything around me. And I loved looking through the photos that I had at the end when I got home. I still have a pile of those photos somewhere. I'm not sure where, but they're somewhere. And sometimes when I find them, I still go through them. I absolutely fell in love with travel photography at the age of 13. But as a 13-year-old or 14-year-old in a small town in Canada, I grew up in a town of 6,000 people. There's not exactly a lot of opportunities for travel photography. And you also kind of get sucked into the life of the town. So I basically focused on sports and sports and sports until I got out of high school. Out of high school, I found myself depressed. Honestly, I was absolutely depressed. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I took some university classes. I worked as road construction, pipeline construction, oil and gas, agriculture. I was a pizza delivery boy. I worked at Foot Locker. I was a bicycle courier in downtown Calgary in the middle of winter. All while trying to take classes as well. And I just didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I was so frustrated that it was just overwhelming. So at a certain point, I decided I'm going to start from scratch. And I took all my money and I went to Central America and I traveled for 3 months. And when I was down there, I just felt so alive. They say that, travel, you find yourself. I didn't go down there trying to find myself, although it seems like it. I went down there just trying to escape and become refreshed. And I don't know if I found myself, but I did find a purpose. I found myself really interested in history, politics, geography of Latin America. And so when I went back to Canada, I enrolled in the University of Calgary. I started studying politics and geography. And eventually I got a degree in human geography, which is kind of like how people's world around them, how their geography around them affects the people. And a degree in political science and my focus was on civil conflict resolution, civil war, things like that. So I was set up on a track to join like government, most likely. When I left university, I honestly didn't have any options. I didn't have any options that I liked. I did decently in university, so I could have done a master's. I had a couple jobs that I was thinking about doing. I thought about trying to join the diplomatic corps, but none of it really excited me. And while I was in university, I was also working in the summers as a tour bus driver. I was like one of those dudes driving the 56 passenger buses, being like, on your left-hand side, you have a giant mountain. I was that guy. And I loved that job. And that summer, I decided to go back to that job just to travel. I just wanted to travel. I wanted to explore, even if it was the same places I went to over and over again as a tour bus driver. I just wanted to travel. I would take people to a viewpoint. I'd say, okay, go out and explore for 20 minutes. And then I would sit there in the bus with a Lonely Planet guide to a country I'd never been to before, and I would just start drawing out itineraries. Those itineraries were like tours that I thought maybe I could operate. Maybe I could lead adventure tours around the world. I could start a company that I just take 10 people to Colombia and just explore for 20, 30 days. That's what I wanted to do. I started a website called brendansadventures.com because that's what I thought my company would be called, Brendan's Adventures. That's why my website to this day still has the stupid name of Brendan's Adventures, because I thought I wanted to start a tour company. That summer, I also realized there's probably somebody else who's already thought of this. So I started Googling adventure tour companies, found a couple jobs actually that were listed, and I took one. I eventually got hired by a company called Kamuka that now went bankrupt, and I was essentially assigned to South America. And so basically straight out of university, I fly to South America not knowing what I'm getting into. I landed in La Paz, and I trained for about 2 weeks with a group traveling La Paz. I went to Machu Picchu, I went to Lake Titicaca, and eventually got all the way up to Quito, Ecuador. And at that point, I was on my own. I'm now an adventure travel tour leader. It was my responsibility to take 16 people and travel. I had a tour route that was 56 days, 2 months from Quito, Ecuador, all the way down to Santiago, Chile. I'd go 56 days down, I'd get 4 or 5 days holiday, and then I'd go 56 days back up. And I just did that back and forth for a year. And it was a pretty intense job. I was not only, guiding 16 people, often to places I'd never been before, but I was also organizing absolutely everything. The company would give me a credit card charged with my budget, and then I would have to book transport, hotels, meals, all of that thing for all the guests. Basically, I was a babysitter to 16, 18 to 50-year-olds for 56 days. And it was a full-on job where it was 24 hours. And I was only paid, I think it was $45 a week. Plus I got $15 a day in meal allowances, but that's really not enough to survive. Especially as like a 26-year-old or however old I was, 24-year-old. I used to eat a lot. And so I definitely didn't save any money or make any money in that year. But what I did get to do was explore. And I got a lot of experience just traveling and just managing travel. And I got a lot of opportunities to have experiences I wouldn't have gotten to do otherwise. I hiked the Inca Trail. I stayed with families on Lake Titicaca. I crossed the Atacama. I did all sorts of crazy things, and I had so many crazy adventures and experiences. And I met a girl. When I was in Peru, I met a girl who was a doctor, and we started dating. And we dated kind of long distance as I continued to do this job. And as I did this job, I started a blog. I started travel writing, I guess. I have an uncle who was an editor at a newspaper in Canada. And he used to say to me, you love travel, you like writing, why don't you become a travel writer? And I always used to laugh and think that that's not a real job that people have. But I kind of just did that for fun, if only to like, share what I've been doing with myself in the future so I could remember what I did in the past. And I started doing that a little bit. And at one point I decided, you know what, maybe I should send one of these articles off to a magazine just to see what happens. And a magazine actually bought the article. I think they paid $600 for my first ever article sale. No, I remember specifically it was $250. They paid $250, which to me at that time was like enough to travel on independently for a week. And at that time, I think I had 50 days left in my contract, and I thought to myself, okay, I'm all in. I'm going to become a travel writer. It was kind of like this false hope, though, that this was easy. I sent one article off, it got bought. Over those 50 days, I sent article after article after article off, and I think I maybe sold one more article for $150. So at the end of my contract as an adventure tour leader, I moved in with my girlfriend and her family in Peru. From there, I had a base that I could explore places in Peru. And I thought, I'm going to make myself a local specialist, travel to places like the Colca Canyon, Lake Titicaca, and Lima, Nazca, all over Peru, Huacachina, and just kind of create myself a little specialization so that if people needed articles from Peru, they could contact me. But the relationship went pretty sour. If I'm being honest, it was a pretty toxic relationship. And I think that she was almost like a little bit embarrassed of me. I had no money. She was from a very well-to-do family. And I think she was a little bit embarrassed that I was just a travel photographer, just a travel writer at the time. And not only just a travel writer, like a nobody. Like I had no jobs, I had no assignments, I had nothing guaranteed. And eventually we broke up. I got kicked out of the house. And I no longer had that safety net of, a place to come home to every night, like meals every night. I think I was living on like nothing because it was all being paid for by her and by her family, my housing, my food, everything. So when that crutch was kicked out, I headed down to Chile, and I realized that I had enough money to travel for about a month and a half without making any money. And I was living on about $30, $35 a day. So I kind of was like, okay, time to get it in gear. I got to Arica, Chile, and I literally sent off 100 pitches. Travel magazines, newspapers, tour companies, offering whatever I could do for anything. I got a couple small articles or a couple small, not assignments, but people saying, hey, we're looking for stuff from here. If you go there, submit something. And I got one really amazing email from a company called Gecko's Adventures, which was an adventure tour company saying, we love what you're doing. We have an extra spot on our Antarctica cruise expedition ship in December. If you want to go, the spot is yours in exchange for all the photos and videos you take on the trip. And I was like, no brainer, let's go. So I headed down to Antarctica. I had, like I said, about a month to survive, so I didn't have to make too much money on the way. Got to Antarctica, did the trip, was super proud of the things I did on that trip. Looking back on it, my photos were absolutely terrible, but since such a small amount of people got to go to Antarctica at that time, my images were very few that were okay. And I got accepted by a stock agency because of those photos. And that was really the first source of travel photography income I had. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it was $5 a month, but that was $5 a month. That was one meal a month. All of a sudden, I'm starting to chip away at the amount of money I need to earn to survive. And I started to think, maybe travel photography has some merit as well as the writing. Maybe I can make some money from the photos as well. I had literally spent every last penny I had before going to Antarctica on a Canon T2i and a 70-200 f4 lens. So when I got back from Antarctica, I was so all in on this job that I literally I didn't have enough money to get home. I didn't have enough money to get another week. But luckily, the Geckos team liked what I did so much, they actually offered me a monthly, like a monthly gig, or like a monthly, not salary, but contracting gig, managing their social media. My job was to manage their Twitter and help with their Facebook, and also document things. So I was supposed to be photographing things, I was supposed to be responding to people, I was supposed to be creating media for them. And I can't remember how much I was earning, but let's call it $1,000 a month. And that was enough for me to survive. And that connection was so valuable to me because not only did it give me a base to earn some money, but it also allowed me to go on some of their trips. So I got to go to Iguazu Falls with them. I traveled Brazil with them. I traveled Central America with them. I went to the Galapagos Islands with them. And I was never paid for any of those trips, but it gave me the opportunity to gather information, to gather stories, to gather photos. It basically gave me free accommodation and travel for a little bit of time. Now that gig only lasted, let's call it a year. And over that year, I'd traveled all the way around South America and I'd gone through some hard times. At a certain point, my camera buggered out. I realized that I owed the Canadian government thousands of dollars because my my student loan couldn't be deferred because I wasn't living in Canada. I wasn't a resident of Canada anymore. And I had a huge documentary assignment that happened and I lost all the photo files due to a corrupt file. And I went broke. And I wouldn't say that I went broke. I went basically broke. I eventually found myself in Colombia, and thankfully I had a friend who was starting travel blogging at the time, and he had money because he was also day trading, and he said to me, "Come live with me in Colombia and we will try to make this work. I'll cover your accommodation. You can pay me when you can pay me. And we'll just see what happens." And I basically lived in Colombia on and off for a year doing other little adventures. And it was a pretty fun time, to be honest. We would sit in this apartment and we would just write and write and write. And we were blogging and we were writing travel articles. And I was honestly struggling a lot to make money. It was like this funny thing because I'd be watching my bank account go from having money to not having money. And then you'd get paid for an assignment and it would jump back up and then it would slowly drop. And it was like always trying to beat, broke. And I remember basically every single week when it was time to pay the rent or pay for food or something, I'd see my bank account almost done. And I'd say, if I don't have money by Monday, I have to go to the university and start teaching English classes to pay the bills. And luckily, it never got to that point. Something always came up. And eventually, something big came up. And that's that my blog started to get really popular. And I started earning money on advertising on my travel blog. It was this almost full year in Colombia just writing and storytelling and, just sharing my life, kind of like what I'm doing now. And I went away from doing traditional travel writing that was kind of boring, to be honest, and I moved towards storytelling. And that turned out to be a really popular thing. And at that time, things just started rolling for me as a travel writer. I started picking up article assignments for big newspapers. And I started to generate enough income that I was comfortable enough traveling full time. So I left Colombia and I headed to Africa. On the way to Africa, I'd stopped and I did some assignments in Europe. And I started to discover something that we now call influencer life. And back then, there was no such thing as an influencer. Back then, I'm not sure the job actually existed the way that it happened. And I'm not going to try to act like I was the first influencer because there was other influencers. But I started picking up jobs that were based around my blog, that were based around my Twitter, and things like that. So I had gotten a rail pass to travel Europe. I was given free hostel stays from a company called Hostel World. And the amount I needed to spend to travel just went significantly down. And it allowed me to save more money for travel. I was also doing a lot of photography. I was finding myself really diving into the photography, especially the stock photography. Eventually, I get down to Africa, and I traveled Africa. I was in Africa for nearly 2 years. And again, I'm still a travel writer at this point. I'm not a travel photographer. I'm making my money blogging. I'm making my money selling travel articles to newspapers and magazines and things like that. And I'm still not making a lot of money. I'm still breaking even. Let's call it, I'm making $2,000 a month, and I'm spending $2,000 a month. And I'll get into some of the other stories from Africa in future podcasts, but there's just way too many of them. But Africa was transformative to me. I was there for 2 years. I had so many crazy experiences and so many stories to tell. And it was on that trip that I started to vlog. Not on the channel you're watching now, but I had another channel called It's My Life 365 that's really embarrassing now to look back at because of the quality. But it was this concept that me and my buddy had where, hey, we live pretty interesting lives. Why don't we just do like a 3 to 5 minute snippet of our lives every day and post that to YouTube? And he did it on his channel, I did it on my channel, and I did that for almost 2 years down Africa. And that kind of got me into the YouTube world. It also started to get me into the photography world. The more I held a camera in my hands, the more I loved it. And the more I wanted to capture the world, and the more I wanted to share the world. And part of it was I was just getting sick of writing. I'd been a travel writer now for over 2 years, maybe 3 years. And everything I was writing just felt so boring. It felt like cliche after cliche after cliche. I just couldn't get past it. Whereas photography, every time I went out, it was a different experience. I didn't need to write words. I didn't need to find ways to describe things. I could let the photo, speak for itself. And what I also really loved about photography at the time was that I'm not an artistic person. If I picked up this pen and paper here, I couldn't draw anything. I struggle with the stick man. But photography was this outlet, much like writing was early, for me to be creative and for me to be artistic and feel artistic. And I felt so empowered by photography that it just made me want to go all in on it. So when I was done in Africa, I decided to cut out almost all my travel writing. I had one pretty reliable source of income, which was the Toronto Star. I was doing these articles that were travel photography mixed with travel writing, which was beautiful. And aside from that, I was like, I'm just going to dive 100% in on photography. I joined another stock agency. I joined a big stock agency. I started not pitching my articles to magazines and newspapers and things like that. I started pitching my photography. I had a really amazing conversation with a travel photographer at a conference, and he sat me down and he said, how much money did you make last year? And I said, let's call it $12,000. And he said, I made $150,000 last year. And I never wanted to make money, but I was also sick of being broke. So in that conversation, he said, this is my list of 10 different things you can do to make money through your photography. And on that list, it was things like stock photography. It was influencer photography. It was Instagram, which I'd now been on for a year. It was things like pitching a travel destination that you would go to their destination and photograph it for them. It was selling photos to magazines. And I went through this checklist and decided to just devote everything to that, but then also to start a YouTube channel that was devoted to photography. And I think it was at that point that I switched to posting videos about photography that I actually became a travel photographer full time. I totally stopped writing and I just focused on photography. The story's almost anticlimactic, isn't it? It's not like there was this grand awakening in me that just decided I need to be a travel photographer. For me, it was all about the travel. It always was. How do I continue to travel? What's that means to travel? It started out as writing. Eventually, it was photography and videography even. But to me, the goal was always travel. The goal was always, how do I make enough money to keep traveling? And so I definitely stumbled into this career as a travel photographer. And if you're looking for advice on how to become a travel photographer, I think that the only answer is to just do it. You kind of just have to take the risk. So yeah, I didn't study to become a photographer. I learned my photography through this book called The Digital Photography something. Intro to Digital Photography by Scott Kelpie. That's the first and only book I read on photography. And I learned from being out in the real world and making mistakes. I didn't go to university for photography. I just stumbled on this career. And I know that's kind of weird and hard to believe, but that's just how it is. And I think that the only lesson or the only advice I'm going to give you is something that my mom told me once when I was really young and probably regrets it. And that's find what you love to do, find out how to make money from it. And that's always what I've done. I knew I loved travel, so I had to find a way to make money from it. Started out as a adventure tour leader, eventually into writing, eventually into photography, and who knows what it'll be in the future. So that's it. I think I'll be back next week. Maybe next episode I'll talk about the time that I went super, super broke in my first year as a travel journalist. Slept on beaches, worked as a bartender, ate ramen noodles for a week. Don't know how I got through that. But I think we'll talk about that next week. So let me know what you guys think about the podcast in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.